Hi everyone. In this lesson we're going to be looking at ATP, what it is, why it's so important, and the locations in the cell where it is synthesized. Keywords for this lesson, quite a lot of them, and you need to be able to use these in your answers when you're writing test questions. Okay, so key ones, obviously respiration, mitochondria or mitochondrion if it's singular, aerobic, anaerobic, glycolysis, pyruvate, also known as pyruvic acid, lactate or lactic acid, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. Okay, the learning objectives for this lesson are detailed here, so please make sure you understand them. And we're going to get started. Okay, so as ever, there's an alternative video that you can use. If you would like to watch this, I'd totally recommend it. Otherwise, we'll continue on. Okay, so just to recap what you should already know, metabolism is the name given to all the chemical reactions that happen in the human body cells. Okay, so these are all the chemical reactions. We can categorize these as anabolism, which are synthesis reactions, or catabolism, which are breakdown reactions. So what we need to understand first of all is what are the two major inputs for metabolic processes to occur. And hopefully you know that these are oxygen, which we get from the air that we breathe in, and principally from glucose, which we get through eating food and digesting it, and those small glucose molecules being absorbed into our body cells via facilitated diffusion. Okay, so let's look at cellular respiration and what it is. So as we've already established, it's a metabolic process, so it's a series of chemical reactions in which food, chiefly glucose, is broken down to release energy. We focus on glucose because it's a monosaccharide. So remember, the word mono means one, it's a simple sugar. However, we can also metabolize amino acids, that's the smallest component of proteins, or fatty acids, which are the smallest components of lipids. These can all be broken down to regenerate ATP, which of course is adenosine triphosphate. Monosaccharides, chiefly glucose, are the main energy source that we use for generating ATP, so we will focus on them for the rest of the lesson. Okay, so we're getting into the chemistry a little bit here, but you don't really need to know the molecular formula. I'm just showing you this to illustrate a point. There are 6 carbon atoms in one glucose molecule. This H12 tells us there's 12 hydrogens, and the O tells us that there are 6 oxygens. Now, they're arranged in this hexagonal shape, and we have these solid lines between the atoms, and this represents a bond. And you can see that up here in this other molecular model. So the energy that's locked up in this glucose molecule is stored in the bonds. So when we break these chemical bonds, we release energy, and that energy can be used for a variety of functions, but it has to be harnessed in the correct way. So first thing that we need to know is how we can summarize this reaction. So cellular respiration is summarized in this word equation. I've also given you the molecular formula. You don't need to remember this. However, it does help you to understand that we have got a carbohydrate plus oxygen, which is broken down into carbon dioxide and water, and crucially, energy in the form of ATP as well. If you're not a chemistry person, I just need you to remember this. Okay, so let's recap what we've learned so far. We know that glucose is the main compound broken down during cellular respiration. We would refer to this as the main respiratory substrate. So glucose is the main respiratory substrate because it's mostly used in respiration, so that is cellular respiration, and the substrate meaning that it's the main substance that is broken down. When the chemical bonds in our respiratory substrate are broken, we release energy, and that energy is used in cellular respiration to form ATP. Okay, so we now know that the form of energy that we refer to is adenosine triphosphate, and it forms through a series of reactions. So glucose that is broken down during aerobic respiration or anaerobic respiration means that this low energy molecule, which is adenosine diphosphate, so the di tells you that there's two phosphate groups there. When that glucose is broken down, adenosine diphosphate will join with another phosphate molecule, forming adenosine triphosphate. So we go from a low energy molecule, that's ADP, and then we form a high energy molecule, ATP. So if we look at that here in a cartoon, this molecule here represents ATP. So this is adenosine, that's this section here, and then that's 1, 2, 3 phosphates. So ATP, and the full battery icon here is letting us know that it's a high energy molecule. Now, a lot of that energy is stored in the terminal bond. So terminal just means the end or the last one. So if you have a terminal station, it's the last station on the line. Here is where lots of that energy that we got from breaking down glucose is stored. So when we break that bond, okay, we release that energy. So this ADP is a lower energy molecule, and we have released energy in that reaction. Now, if we think about ADP and ATP in terms of batteries, adenosine diphosphate, so that's two phosphates, is a low energy molecule. Okay, so it's not got the full charge in the battery. When we join this phosphate onto the end of the ADP and we form ATP, we have a fully charged battery, so there's lots of energy in this terminal bond that we can use to put into other processes. Now, your body is very efficient. It doesn't like to just make new things all the time. It will reuse and recycle as much as possible. So this formation of ATP from ADP plus P is a cyclical reaction. So we're constantly breaking down and building up. So here we have our low energy ADP plus P. When we get energy from food, that energy allows this phosphate to join on to the end here. Now, when that joins on, we get ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, forming. And again, most of that energy is in that end bond. When we break down ATP, let's say we want to do some sort of cellular work, such as contract muscles or grow new cells, we release that energy to do that work, and we're back down into our low energy ADP. And that's why we need to keep eating to regenerate those molecules so we can continue to do work. Okay, so here's another quick summary of what we've learned so far. When glucose, that's our main respiratory substrate, is broken down in cells, chemical bonds are broken and energy is released. Adenosine diphosphate is our low energy molecule, and when it receives the energy from glucose that's been broken down, the phosphate that's left over will join with ADP, and energy is stored in that chemical bond at the end, thus forming adenosine triphosphate. ATP is a high energy molecule that we can use in cellular processes or metabolism, and the processes that we can use ATP for are listed below. Now, I've given you quite an extensive list here, and it's really important that you are able to name at least 3 of these. Okay, so a lot of questions in exam papers and test papers will ask you to give 2 to 3 examples of what ATP is used for in the body. Simple examples that we've learned about so far would be active transport, so that's moving molecules across the cell membrane against the concentration gradient. We've learned about cell division and growth. You should know that from your previous school years. And also muscle contraction. If you can learn maybe 4, that would really help you in the long run. Finally, we know that the build-up and the breakdown of ATP to ADP plus P is cyclical and is constantly occurring in the human body. Okay, so now that we've learned about what ATP and ADP are, we're going to learn about where they happen within the cell. So we know, I've alluded to these two words before. That's aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So the word aero refers to oxygen, and if something has the prefix an, it means without. So we have respiration that occurs with oxygen or respiration that occurs without. So as a little summary here, anaerobic respiration we'll talk about first. This is respiration in the absence of oxygen. So there's very little oxygen present. This type of respiration will only happen in the cytosol or the cytoplasm of the cell, and it leads to the incomplete breakdown of glucose. So because glucose is not fully broken down, we're not breaking all the chemical bonds, therefore we produce significantly less energy as a result. If we contrast that with aerobic respiration, it does require oxygen. So aerobic respiration does require oxygen to occur. It occurs in 2 places within the cell, the cytoplasm and the mitochondria. And because it happens in 2 different places in the presence of oxygen, glucose is completely broken down and we get significantly more ATP per glucose molecule. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the first stage of respiration, which is glycolysis. Now, the glyco part means glucose, and the lysis part means splitting. So this word glycolysis literally does mean glucose splitting. Key thing to know about glycolysis is that it occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell and does not require oxygen to work. This process, glycolysis or glucose splitting, happens in both aerobic and anaerobic respiration, and that's really important to know. It happens in both. Now we know that glucose is a carbon molecule, so it's a carbon-based molecule, and it has 6 carbon atoms in it. Because glucose is being split, it's split into 2 lots of 3 carbon pyruvate molecules. Now, I'm just telling you the number of carbons involved to help you understand that it's split down the middle. Now, this process of breaking those 2 chemical bonds yields 2 ATP molecules. Just as a little summary here, so glycolysis is represented by glucose being split and 2 ADP plus 2 phosphates are synthesized in that process. Because 2 chemical bonds are broken, we produce 2 adenosine triphosphate, and the molecule that we produce as a result are 2 lots of pyruvate, sometimes known as pyruvic acid. This occurs in the cytoplasm, so glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm and can occur without oxygen, but it does occur in both aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Okay, so if we look at anaerobic respiration in a little more detail, we understand that glycolysis is the partial breakdown of glucose, so it's broken down into 2 lots of pyruvate. And we also know that 2 ATP are produced. So if oxygen continues to not be available for your cells, this pyruvate molecule has no option but to convert into another molecule which is called lactate and also known as lactic acid. Now, these lactate molecules are stored in your muscle cells, and eventually lactate is converted in the liver to glucose or glycogen for storage. So we have glucose, it's partially broken down to pyruvate. In the absence of oxygen, nothing can be broken down further, so pyruvate is converted to lactate or lactic acid, and your liver will convert that lactate or lactic acid back into glucose, and it will store it until it can break it down later. Now, this lactate or lactic acid molecule is really important to you during strenuous physical activities such as sprinting, which is an anaerobic activity. You're not using very much oxygen during that process. Okay, so what we have learned so far is that in anaerobic respiration, there's no oxygen being used, and there are two stages. There's glycolysis, which occurs in the cytoplasm, and that is the breakdown of glucose into two lots of pyruvate. We then are forced down an anaerobic pathway where pyruvate is converted into lactate, and this also occurs in the cytoplasm. The lactate is then taken to the liver for another process. Okay, here we've got a full summary. This is allowing you to look at a glance at what is happening at each stage, and we now know that the overall ATP yield is only 2. Okay, so for those that require a diagram, here's a little flow diagram to summarize everything we've looked at so far. Glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose into pyruvic acid, and we form 2 ATP as a result. When there's no oxygen available, we form lactic acid or lactate, and this lactic acid will then go to the liver and further reactions happen there. Now we're going to be looking at what happens if there is oxygen present. So if oxygen is available, then we go down the aerobic pathway. So this means we leave the cytoplasm and we enter the mitochondria, where we fully break down that glucose. In order for the pyruvic acid or the pyruvate to get into the mitochondria, it goes through another step where it's converted into something called acetyl coenzyme A. Okay, so glucose is broken down into pyruvic acid or pyruvate. Each molecule of pyruvate is further broken down into acetyl coenzyme A, which can then enter the mitochondria. Now, while in the mitochondria, this molecule, this acetyl coenzyme A, is fully broken down through a series of reactions. The first step is called the Krebs cycle, or sometimes known as the citric acid cycle. And then the next step is the electron transport chain, or electron transport system. Now you'll notice within the mitochondria we have these series of folds, and these folds provide a larger surface area to volume ratio so that reactions can happen much faster. Okay, so the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain occur in the mitochondria, and this step will only happen if oxygen is present. So during the full breakdown of glucose, we get carbon dioxide and water forming as our metabolic wastes. The Krebs cycle will yield a further 2 molecules of ATP, and the electron transport chain can yield a further 34 molecules of ATP. So this is really important. So what we're saying is when oxygen is present, we can actually fully break down glucose and get potentially a further 36 molecules of ATP. Now, if we compare that to glycolysis, where we only get 2, this seems like a more efficient pathway to get energy for our body to carry out its metabolic processes. Okay, so just a visual summary for you again. Pyruvic acid is further broken down into acetyl coenzyme A. When oxygen is present, this will then enter the mitochondria and the Krebs cycle will occur. As a result of the Krebs cycle, we get carbon dioxide forming plus 2 ATP. The next step is the electron transport system, and from this we yield 34 ATP plus water. So the three steps in aerobic respiration are glycolysis, the same as anaerobic respiration, which still occurs in the cytoplasm. And we have two further steps, which are the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system, which both occur in the mitochondria. Here's a more detailed summary of what we've talked about so far. So the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain certainly require oxygen. This is where our metabolic wastes are produced, and we get a total yield of 36 ATP from that. So one glucose molecule can potentially yield 38 ATP, but only when oxygen is present. Okay, here's a summary of what we've talked about so far in this section. Aerobic respiration only occurs when oxygen is present, and the complete breakdown of glucose can yield up to 38 ATP. When that oxygen is present, the products of glycolysis, which are pyruvate, can be further broken down to acetyl coenzyme A, which will enter the mitochondria. The majority of ATP is synthesized in the mitochondria via the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, and the inner folds of the mitochondria have a large surface area to volume ratio so that there's a faster rate of reaction for ATP production. The metabolic wastes that are produced in this reaction are carbon dioxide and water. Okay, so that's the end of the lesson. Here I've got an example of an exam question that I'd like you to have a go at. First of all, whenever you're looking at exam questions, please always look at the image. The images in biology are always there to help you. So here we are showing a cross-section of muscle tissue, and we are shown that there are lots of ATP. We know that because we know that muscles are constantly undergoing contraction, which is a very energetic process, therefore they will need lots of ATP. So first of all, that should get you thinking, and that helps you answer the first question. Explain why muscle cells require many mitochondria. Hopefully you've got that answer from what I just said. Next question, name one substance produced by a cell carrying out aerobic respiration. There are multiple answers for that. Second question is a bit more involved. In the absence of oxygen, cells will still produce a limited quantity of ATP. State the name of this process and describe the pathway that these cells take and the products produced. At this point, I'd like you to pause the video and see if you can answer part 2 of A and B without looking at the answers. Once you've had a go, unpause and the answers are on the next slide. Okay, hopefully you have achieved your maximum number of points here. For part 2, a substance produced by the cell carrying out aerobic respiration is of course carbon dioxide or water. If you wrote ATP, that would also still achieve marks. For part B, it is of course anaerobic respiration, and the points that I've underlined here are things that you must say in order to achieve that 1 mark. If you weren't successful in getting 5 out of 5, I would strongly recommend that you stop and write out a model answer and highlight these key terms. Okay, that's the end of the lesson. Thanks for watching.